University of Toledo is surrounded by experts, and we tap into those experts here on Rocket Talk.
For nearly 2 decades now, people have waited for and argued about removing U.S. troops from Afghanistan. And as you know, that happened but didn't go as planned. Now, everyone knows that story, but today we're going to dig a little deeper. I'm Jason Hibbs, and our guest is Dr. Joel Voss, an associate professor of political science here at the University of Toledo with areas of expertise in international law, international relations, and human rights. And perhaps most exciting, a brand new father to a beautiful baby girl. Congrats to you and the wife on that.
Thanks so much.
She is adorable. So jumping right in. So the history and political science textbooks are being written now. What do you think that they'll say about the war on terror and the war in Afghanistan?
Well, I think unfortunately history books and political science books will look at our time in Afghanistan as a case study in worst practices for state building and post-conflict reconciliation. And we've been doing that now for about 15 or so years, where the writing's sort of been on the wall, and we knew it was not going the way that we wanted, and now we have a sort of eulogy for it, or we will have a eulogy for it in the next year or so.
So we remember 9/11 very well, but most of our students were babies or not even born. What are those in-class conversations like about the war?
Well, I think there are really 3 types of students to think about here. There are students who served in Afghanistan or Iraq, because it has been ongoing for 20 years, which means that there's a wide breadth of students who have served. There are students who have family members that may have served. And then there are students who have no military experience whatsoever. For those in the third category and the second category, it's all academic, right? It's something that we talk about like it happened yesterday, but for them it's completely foreign. For example, it would be like the Vietnam War for like you or I, right? Like we know it's a big thing in U.S. history. We know it might impact some people we know, but we don't really get it. And that's the case for a lot of students, which makes for good political science because they're unbiased about it. But it's also interesting that now they're young enough to not know one of the biggest things in the last half century for U.S. foreign policy.
So on the Taliban, they have tried to present themselves as more moderate. They've promised to respect women's rights. They've said that they're going to make sure that Afghanistan is not a place that will harbor terrorists. Do you buy that?
It's early to tell, and so it's always tough to make predictions. But I buy some of it, and then not other parts of it. I do think that the Taliban aren't happy about the idea of foreign terrorists being in Afghanistan, because I think they've seen that that's caused them problems. I think they want to solidify their government, and they don't want to deal with the headache of keeping foreign terrorists on their soil. Having said that, also there are terrorist groups there like ISIS-K, right, which has been in the news because of the Kabul airport attacks, who aren't allies with the Taliban, right? So these are people that the Taliban have to actively fight and then to push out of the country so they can have full control over their country. And so I think that part I do buy. The part about human rights and women's rights, I think it's quite early to tell. And I think the reason is the Afghan government is just forming. They're realizing now that a lot of their finances are tied to foreign governments, to foreign aid, those sorts of things. And I think you'll see a lot of states using aid as a stick to make sure that the Taliban don't repress as far as they did last time they were in power 20 years ago.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. What advice would you give to other nations dealing with this new Afghan government?
That's a great question, and I should get paid more for it. What would I do? What would I do if I were going to advise other governments? It's tough. On the one hand, you don't want the Afghan economy to crash completely, and there's great fear of that. Because if that happens, there's going to be more and more people harmed, innocent people, right? But at the same time, clearly you don't want Afghanistan to go back to where it was 20 years ago, where women were readily suppressed and dissidents were killed and things of that sort, right? And so my best advice for a foreign government dealing with Afghanistan is to use carrots and sticks to push them in a direction that is more acceptable, but to not completely crash their country, because then you make things much worse. You create, in essence, if their entire country economy collapses, you get more of a Libya situation, which we don't talk about much in the news, but Libya has been a catastrophe now for half a decade or more.
How worried should the U.S. be about terrorism, about our safety?
Well, the United States should always be concerned with terrorism, without a doubt, and so should basically all countries. Should we worry about Islamic terrorism from Afghanistan? We should keep an eye on it. I don't think that's our number one priority. If you look at all the data on recent terrorist attacks, most of our terrorist attacks are homegrown, and they're from the alt-right. And so that's much different from, say, the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, right? Having said that, you shouldn't put blinders on and miss potential threats from any corner of the world.
So it was President Trump who announced the plan to pull out and sign that deal with the Taliban, limiting U.S. military action. But President Biden, who followed through, put that date on it. Politically, which party do you think will pay a price for the way things unfolded?
Well, I think there's an important underlying question there that I want to answer that you didn't ask, okay. Which is that we're talking about a 20-year debacle, which means that that is at least 2 Republican presidencies and 2 Democratic presidencies, and 2, that are responsible for this. It's not just a Republican or a Democratic thing, right? And I think in the U.S. we're picking our teams and we're wearing our Democratic stripes or our Republican stripes. And what we need to do is take a step back and realize that these are policy failures from administrations from both sides. Now, having said that, it happened on Biden's watch, so he's the one that will pay the price because it's his midterm elections, right? If you switched positions and had Trump president now and Biden being the prior president, President Trump would pay the price. Now, how much of a price that is, we'll see in a year and a half or so.
What about the Capitol Hill testimony? We're hearing General Milley testimony on Capitol Hill. Is there anything we should be watching for with that?
I think right now the best thing to do is to take a step back and sort of, figure out what happened, what went wrong a year or 2 from now. Right now, the U.S. is quite on the defensive. We obviously need to figure out what happened in the last month or so and, why it went so rapidly, the overthrow of the U.S. forces in Afghanistan. But I think we need to take a slower pace when we're digesting and dissecting what happened there.
So the State Department says there are still citizens, U.S. citizens in Afghanistan and green card holders.
Sure.
How worried should we be about those people?
Well, I think if they were my family, I would be quite worried. I think in the grand scheme of things, though, I don't think we should be that worried, because I think the Taliban have gone out of their way, and this goes back to the women's rights issues, for example, to show that they're, at least right now, they're trying to be a good player. And in fact, what came up in the news very briefly right after the evacuations was that the Taliban worked covertly with the United States to get American citizens out, because they knew that some of the gates were unsafe because there was a lot of chatter, right, for a potential terrorist attack, and so on and so forth. And so I think what you're seeing is the ability of the Taliban to try to at least not anger the United States much more. So I think they'll get out if they want to get out, but it's also important to note that some people are still trying to stay in, right, for humanitarian reasons and other things.
So we've seen a lot of events unfold recently. What worries you the most?
I think there are 2 things that probably worry me the most about Afghanistan. And the first is that collapse that I talked about just a second ago. If the economy collapses and you get a civil war in Afghanistan, then that's going to be a catastrophic failure of governments, and you're going to see a lot of people moving across borders, which will, of course, potentially destabilize other regions, Pakistan, for example. You see this anytime there's a mass movement of individuals, right? Think Syria, for example, that's still ongoing. So that's the first one. The second one is long-term, what do we do about all the advances that were made in Afghanistan? And they weren't perfect, but they were made. What do we do about that moving forward? It's going to be very tough to be a young woman in Afghanistan who lived the last 15 or so odd years, 20 years if she's 20, right, under a completely different regime. What does that mean for them, for those for those individuals? That's an interesting individual story, I think, that I'm quite worried about, especially as a father of a young girl now, right? It's I spend a lot of time thinking about that.
Yeah, so just real quickly as we wrap up, what can we do here at home?
Well, the first thing we can do is help refugees who have come into the United States. And there are a lot of legitimate organizations that are out in communities across the U.S. Who are trying to help these individuals. And so, donate money, donate items that are needed to help them, take in someone if you can. That's the first thing that we can do at home.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Doctor. We really appreciate you for coming on. That's all the time we have. We'll be back next week with more Rocket Talk from the University of Toledo.